Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iron Age comic review. And today we are taking a look at Ghost of the Badlands, a comic written by Razor Fist and illustrated by George Alexopoulos. This is the black and white version. I got this because personally, I prefer monochrome comics to colored stuff, although I don't have a problem in particular with colored comics. And in the case of George Alexopoulos, I think he's more than capable of it. But it's a personal preference, so this is the version I got, and I'm very happy to be able to review this. Not only because it's a very interesting looking comic in a fairly underserved genre, but because it's a comic from the man who coined the term for the Iron Age gathering of artists. And I thought it would be interesting to see what kind of a story he's looking to tell in this space. A couple of things to talk about first and foremost. One is, as usual, the book itself, and this book is quite big for an independently published comic. It is 9 by 12. And if you're thinking to yourself, where am I going to put that on my shelf? You can pretty much get in line. Ideally, you'll put it next to your copies of Earthworm Jim and Bigfoot Bill because it's about the same size. But if you don't have those, either because you lack culture or because you weren't around that part of the internet when they were available, you may have to get a custom bookshelf. It's a big book, and I think that actually serves the comic quite well because it lets you get a good look at George's art, which is quite beautiful, as it always is. The pages are actually kind of a matte satin finish. I really like that. Longtime viewers of this channel know I'm not a fan of high gloss paper in my picture books. I think it makes it harder to actually see everything that's going on the page at once. And this is like a really great look and feel for the page. It has that kind of nice vellum feel to it. Maybe that's not the best word for it, but it doesn't feel like you're running your hand along the hood of a car when you touch the page. It feels like a really good, high quality book. It's not a slick and glossy like a magazine. It is a work of literature pulled off the shelf. A really good choice for the finish and presentation here. It has my usual gripe. Of course, there are no page numbers in here. Yes, that is my hobby horse, and I'm going to ride it into the ground. There are no page numbers. It's a very small thing, but I do find it useful to have that to call on. Like if I want to remember or direct someone to a page or a line that I really like, it would be nice to say, hey, look on this page. And I can't do that in this book. Very sad. But certainly not a deal breaker. All in all, the fit and finish is great. It's a soft cover, as you can see, but it is a very nice soft cover. It does have a glossy, high finish cover on it. That is a little bit more magazine-y than you might like. Personally, I prefer a hardback book, but I recognize that there are costs involved with that. I don't remember if there was a hardback version of this offered or not, but this was, for the price, you're getting a lot here, and I don't know as putting a hardback on it adds a whole lot as compared to the increase in price, especially for a 12 by 9 book, which again, that's a pretty big book, and the bigger your cover is, the more it costs. There's a lot of things to think about here besides just the presentation. So I understand, you don't have one available at a price point that I would like. I probably should have gone back and checked the campaign to see if that was available. I know that, I tend to harp on these people that have really big print runs for their books, the Rippaverse, and, even people like Ethan Van Sciver, I think, don't always offer hardback covers. It's something that's nice to have there, and I think if the decision was made to just pull the trigger and do everything hardback, it would probably be cheaper. There are volume discounts. Obviously, I didn't see the quote on this book, so while it would have been nice to have everything run in hardback and available to the public at the price point that kind of savings offer, it may not have been economically feasible. I don't have all the info. I'm just a guy who complains about stories on the internet, and I think it would have been really neat if everybody could have gotten a hardback. But like I said, there's a ton of factors in that. I don't know what I don't know. Artistically, I've talked about George Alexopoulos's Mary Sue series before. The art in that is fantastic. And the art in this is fantastic. It is coming from a completely different approach than the Mary Sue books, however. This is originally, I believe this book was supposed to be just black and white. Colored version was a stretch goal, as I recall. Again, I don't have a perfect recall of all the different elements of the campaign, but I believe it was originally intended in black and white. And as a result, George had to adopt a completely different art style. Whereas his colored books are all done digitally with really delicate and creative and intelligent use of brushes and color. Not a whole lot of hard outlines, but a lot of use of the shapes of the color to guide the eye and that kind of thing, to give depth, layers to the color, that kind of thing. All very well used in those books. And here, that was originally not part of the plan. So George has added hatching everywhere. Tons of hatching, tons of use of line weight to help guide the eye. There appears to be some shading or screen tones. I don't know if that was done on a physical layer. I believe George actually drew all this on Bristol, but don't quote me on it. I know I saw some of the early development work where it looked like that was what was going on, but I don't know if he stuck with that the whole way through, or if he was just doing some pages that way so they would have original art pages to sell. I'm not 100% familiar with the whole development process for this book. But it appears to have all been done using Bristol. And you can kind of see some things on here that hint at that, the way the line work and the line weights are slightly irregular. Now, there are tablets, I suppose, that let you vary line weights by the pressure of your pen tip, but so he could have used that, but my eye, it looks a little bit more like Bristol. There's a lot of clever use of white as well to kind of build negative space and highlights. It's just really beautiful art. I'm trying to find a good page that shows everything that George can do in just a couple of pages. Here's a good. Doesn't give away too much. So here we have this really beautiful establishing shot that shows us a small saloon. Righty, our protagonist, is in here, and he's talking to the bartender. Look at that close up of that face. That is a beautiful small panel right there. It shows us the depth and the cragginess of the bartender's face. A subtle expression that is really wonderful. Likewise, on this facing page, which is harder to show to you. One of these days, I'll get an actual desk cam I can do more easily. But here we have one of our villains. Again, great command of facial acting and expression. Really delicate work around the faces. Beautiful art. Just beautiful. Likewise, in the opening, you can see some of George's commands of action shots. These were actually in the Indiegogo campaign as well. And yeah, you can just see excellent depiction of horses. As someone who's tried to draw a horse in the past, man, are they tough to get a good grasp on. But these look beautiful. There's a lot of scenes of people riding on horseback, engaged in combat. I never saw anything really funky. There's some great expressions in here. And if you've read any of George's stuff, you know he has a very exaggerated sense of expression and caricature. And in this story, that's what you see in some of his satirical cartoons, for example, is not entirely appropriate. But he has that command of the human face that makes it possible for him to do these more serious, but still somewhat exaggerated expressions where he's really bringing a character's emotion to the fore. This is a tour de force from George Alexopoulos, and he's really leveled up. Like, I'm not really familiar with his work outside of some of his satirical stuff in the Mary Sue series, but I've never seen the level of human expression and acting that he has put into this, along with the detail of his settings and, his command of the horse. That sounds weird, but just like you have to have command of the human body in order to act a human character, for these scenes where people are just riding for pages and pages on horseback and shooting or climbing on the stagecoaches or things like that. He has a command of the movement of that animal that is very impressive, and has to have required hours of research and practice and thumbnailing. Really great stuff there. I cannot sing the praises of the art in this book enough. It is written by Razorfist, and I know he's written a couple of novels. I've never read those. I've put his first one on my TBR on the basis of this because I did enjoy the story in here. So I'm going to check one of those out as I get a chance. Like most people who talk about stories on the internet, my TBR is really long, so I don't know when I'll get to it, if ever, because it's also a very fluid thing. But I did enjoy the story that is in here. And it's not complicated, and it's not like Razorfist did not set out to break any molds here. If you looked at the Indiegogo campaign for this and you thought, oh, it's the Shadow in the Old West, you were right. That's exactly what it was. Whether you like that or not, probably going to come down to whether you like the Shadow or not. I am not really an expert on the character of the Shadow. Most of what I've heard about it actually comes from Razorfist himself, and I don't follow Razor as a creator very closely either. So I only get a little bit here and there. I know he really likes the character, has a certain image of the character, and that image of the character very much transfers onto the Ghost of the Badlands. It's a simple story about the ghost avenging people on a bunch of criminals. Nothing wrong with that if you like stories about criminals getting what's coming to them. Also an interesting story about people seeking redemption. And the story is told, as I'm given to understand many Shadow stories are told, through the eyes of one of the ghost's associates. The ghost knows a lot of people across the West who give him information and help him do what it is he does. We never actually see the ghost's face proper. The ghost wears a mask. You can see that here in the back. And that is, for all practical intents and purposes, the face of the ghost. Pretty much anyone who we've seen over the course of this story that is still alive could be the Ghost of the Badlands, except for Righty. Righty actually loses his right arm at the beginning of the story, and we also see him and the Shadow and the Ghost in the same panel at the same time. So they can't be the same character because the Ghost has both of his arms. The Ghost is also pretty obviously not a woman, so that rules out all the female characters. But other than that, most of the male characters we see who are still alive at the end of the story could be the Ghost. And I think that's an intentional and highly stylized choice that fits this kind of story very well. The Ghost is supposed to be something that can just spring out of anywhere and deal with evil wherever it appears. Of course, a lot of what we see behind the scenes, the fact that he has all these informants, that he's constantly moving, and we see him have to do things like reload his weapon and stuff like that. All of these make it very clear he is actually human. He is not a cosmological force of nature dispensing justice on evil wherever it may be. But that is the impression he's trying to build. And by preserving that mystique over the course of the narrative, I think it does kind of help that sense perpetuate in the eyes of the audience. The Ghost himself, I think, is also going to be the thing that may be a sticking point for audiences out there. This is a review, first and foremost. I'm trying to offer my thoughts on the story in a way to tell you whether you will enjoy it. So the Ghost of the Badlands views himself as a God-sent avenger on criminals on behalf of the innocent and on behalf of heaven itself. That is made pretty clear to us in the way he speaks. He speaks very much in the form of King James English. He quotes often from the Bible, or he says things that are very similar to verses from the Bible, but tweaked to fit his situation, or perhaps the ghost's own viewpoint. And that is an interesting character to examine, but not everyone is going to like spending a lot of time with that kind of character. Could come off as pretentious very easily. I think in this story, Razor walks a bit of a line in the way the ghost is presented. And I think by keeping him a secondary character in the story about him, we get enough other flavors here that the ghost is not overpowering. But your mileage is going to vary on that. You may find him getting grating very quickly. I didn't, but, I don't know. If he was on maybe just another page or two, maybe I could have. I can see very much how people would not enjoy reading a 120 page story about a character who is so full of himself that he is willing to put forth his own point of view through the words of God. That is a very common and very human thing to do, and I don't mind seeing characters do it. It is a fine line for any Christian to walk to quote scripture to support a point, because you're not trying to make your own points. Scripture is not to make your points for you, it's to make God's points to the world. Not to get too deep into theology. But anytime you go to make a point and support it with Scripture, as a Christian, you run the danger of trying to put your own words in God's mouth. It's a delicate balancing act, and it doesn't bother me that much that we see a character walking it here. But I've been raised around, preachers and charlatans my whole life. And there is a very thin line between those two categories of people. So I'm used to, using the sword to divide between spirit and flesh, bone and marrow. And if you're coming at this, you've never gone to church, you're a very secular person, if you don't have the tool set to parse what's going on in this story, I think you'll find it a bit off-putting. Now, you may still enjoy jumping into that, in which case, go for it. I think this is building that kind of discernment is a useful set for anyone. But I understand why people who have never engaged with religion at all and view the whole thing as silly will also view this as silly. If you're not mature enough for that kind of thing, maybe you find it difficult to grapple with the story. I think overall, what we get in Ghost of the Badlands is a impartial look at a character who's very sure of his place in the universe, but the narrative itself is not really going out of its way to sell us on the character's place. What we hear about him, we get pretty much from the eyes of others, only occasionally from the ghost himself. And I think that's a good way to look at this kind of character. So, as I said before, our protagonist is actually Righty, a one-armed man who loses his arm in a stagecoach robbery gone bad. By which I mean everybody on the stagecoach dies and everyone in the bandit gang dies, except for Righty, who's one of the coach robbers, and a girl who is one of the people on the coach. The bandits kill everyone else on the coach. Then the ghost of the Badlands kills all of the bandits, except for Righty. He spares because Righty had refused to kill the girl. That's all pretty much set up in the opening, and it's there on the Indiegogo. So I don't think it's really a spoiler to discuss any of that part of the story. The light touches after that. Righty is given an opportunity to work as an associate of the Ghost of the Badlands, and he helps the ghost crack a land ring. Pretty common thing out in the West. All in all, like I said, it's a straightforward story. If you've watched any Western, you've probably seen at least, hints of this kind of storyline. And, many of the big Westerns kind of play in that area as well. El Dorado was one. That's one I actually have a video talking about some of the nuances and complexities of that story. I believe High Noon is kind of in the same area. It's been a long time since I've seen that. So again, people settling a land and then getting pushed out by greedy land barons or the government or Indian tribes. All of these things are stories that have been addressed in Western. The West was a frontier. People settled it. They tried to hold on their claims to the land. It's a difficult thing to do. Not just because there were beings out there, but the land itself was inhospitable. We don't get so much of that aspect in Ghost of the Badlands, though. This is very much a story about an Avenger. So yeah, I think rambling a bit about the Western genre there, but all in all, I think Ghost of the Badlands falls squarely into that archetype. Our protagonist, Righty, is a man lived a bad life and is now trying to turn it around. And he thinks that helping out the ghost is a good way to do it. He meets a lot of unsavory characters, and he helps the ghost deal with them. Pretty straightforward plot, well executed on. One thing that I really like about this story, beyond the well-handled character of the ghost himself, that it's a very quiet story. Westerns are tied up in the landscape and the land they take place on, and there tend to be a lot of wide scenic panoramas, so you can appreciate the thing that is bringing all of these people out here in the first place. The unbridled, open potential of the land is just a magnet for everyone, whether they have good intention or bad intention. And there are a lot of big open shots here. Razor trusted George to be able to illustrate this, and it paid off. I've talked before, especially when talking about the Soul Finder series, how important it is that the writer and the artist of a series be in harmony, and the trust there then produces moments that pay off in the visual storytelling and in the verbal storytelling of a comic for the readers. And outside of Doug Ernst and Bill, name has slipped my mind. I apologize. I believe it is Bill Williamson. I could be mistaken on that. No, Matthew Weldon. Matthew Weldon draws Soul Finder. Those two think very well. I think George Alexopoulos and Razor Fist also think very well in this book. And this is, a 120-page book, so they carried it through a long ways. Just look at this scene. Writing that scene requires a lot of trust in your artist to make it pay off. And it really does come to fruition over the course of this story. It's an impressive bit of writing because authors tend to be very satisfied with our ability to craft words. But when you're writing a comic, you also have to be satisfied with the ability of another person to craft art, assuming you're not drawing it yourself. And obviously, in this case, Razor did not draw most of the illustrations. There are one or two that he did in the back. So all in all, the coordination of art and story are fantastic. Since Razor had to put this together and then essentially be the art director for the book, I think a lot of the credit for that is at his feet. He did very well at it. That's pretty much all I can say, I think, without getting into spoiler talk. So what I'll say here is I will make the recommendation, if you are a big fan of that kind of pulp detective or noir hero who brings justice on behalf of the downtrodden, or who visits criminals to send them to the lake of burning sulfur, if that's your jam, Ghost of the Badlands is definitely for you. If you are a fan of westerns, classic, or spaghetti, I think Ghost of the Badlands is definitely for you. If you enjoy a moral tale of good versus evil, I think Ghost of the Badlands has a lot for you, but it is not quite as explicit and on the nose as some others, especially your typical superhero story is going to be. If you're looking for a heavily character-driven story, if you want a lot of internal dialogue, a lot of studying of motivation, a lot of weighing back and forth of different life paths and things like that, Ghost of the Badlands doesn't have any of it. It's not a story that is about the internal life of characters. It's very much a story that is about action characters. So if that's what you're looking for, I would recommend checking out something else. McClintock is a Western that has some of that. It's also very funny and very entertaining, and it has John Wayne, so great story there. Let's talk about spoilers. And I don't have a whole lot more to add here. There were a couple of things that I did rather enjoy. There's a reference to fairly common legend in the West that you hear in different forms here and there. That was included a story where one tribe chases members of a war band or perhaps entirety of another tribe into a cave. and they are wiped out usually by burning something at the mouth of the cave and they suffocate, or they are simply shot to death with arrows as they run out to escape the smoke. I've heard this legend in a bunch of different forms. Sometimes it's attributed to a kind of Bigfoot legend, other times just another tribe. I really enjoyed seeing it here. I thought that was a nice touch. It definitely gives a bit of that Western flavor to the story, as opposed to just generic Indians are out there, which was true of a lot of the continent at one time or another. I also thought it was interesting that in the Indiegogo there was some updates about the history of Diablo Canyon, and I was expecting more of the story to take place there. And I guess that's not necessarily a story critique, more as it is an advertising critique. I thought that was going to be a really big, major part of the story, and it was a part of the story, but it was not the single most important piece of lore, which I kind of expected it to be. So again, a little bit of expectation versus reality going on there. I think it could have been made a little bit clearer to me that that was not going to be as big a deal as I thought it was. But at the same time, I don't think not a whole lot of it happening in Diablo Canon is that big of a deal either. It was just a surprising thing to me. And if you didn't follow the Indiegogo at all, maybe that's not going to be an issue for you. The last thing that I saw in here was the ultimate ultimate force behind the land grab. Kind of his motivation kind of comes out of nowhere. He has a little speech he gives at the end about how the bridge they're building across the canyon is progress, and progress is unstoppable, and it just comes out of left field. There's two potential reasons for that. The first is because it's an insincere speech that he's just giving to try and distract the ghost. Okay, fair, but why didn't he try and bribe the ghost then? Because this is a guy who seems to work very well via money, and he could have just offered the ghost money rather than giving this speech about progress. And it would fit better with what we see of him doing. He's bribing all these people. So why did he change his methodology with the ghost? Did he already, I mean, everybody kind of already knows something about the ghost, so maybe he surmised that wouldn't work. Maybe that was his thought pattern. It could have been made a little clearer to the audience, I think, to make that play out. The other alternative is that this was a line. He does have a philosophical belief in progress, but that was never established. It just comes out of nowhere. So, I don't want to put too much of the author's point of view in here again, and I'm not terribly familiar with Razor. But what I have heard suggests he often thinks that self-serving people will claim progress as a shield against their misdeeds. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's true as well. But there are also a lot of really blind people who follow those charlatans and are true believers. And I would have liked to know whether this particular character was one or the other. And the inability to parse that is just a tiny bit frustrating. I think actually, given the nature of the story, that's actually more important than being able to completely parse the motives of someone like the Ghost of the Badlands. Because he is such an important character who has so little influence on, so little points of view attached to him. I think his actual point of view could have been made a little clearer. It would have been more satisfying to see him get his comeuppance. Because as it is, as a fan of good and evil and storytelling, I like justice to be poetic most of the time, but especially in a story that is about a direct struggle between good and evil. Ghost of the Badlands very much is. So having that clearer understanding of the villain and whether or not he truly gets poetic justice would have helped me. But that's just my own desire from the story. And if we're not supposed to see his final fall as poetic justice, maybe we don't need to know that. But I hesitate to firmly say the author had one intent or another. So all I can say at this point is I would have liked to have that piece of information to fully parse that resolution to the story. Just my thoughts on things that were done well or could have used a little more work. There wasn't a lot of it because this is a very solid story. And I don't think everyone is going to enjoy this. I think the people who it's for are really going to enjoy it. I had a pretty good time reading it. There is a short prose piece here called As Wax Before Flame. At the end, it is... Oh, there are page numbers for the prose piece. I did not notice that before. There could have been page numbers. They don't take anything away from the art. All I'm saying. So, starts on page 109 and runs to page 116. So it's about 6.5 pages from the looks of it. That's pretty good too. I don't have a whole lot to comment on that other than to say it does kind of expand the lore of the Ghost a little bit. It's a fun read. Got a couple of original illustrations by Razorfist rather than by George Alexopoulos. At least that's what it looked like to me. Yeah, it was a good read, but I don't think it has quite the same level of satisfaction of the longer tale. I don't know if that's because of length or just because it was easier for me to see who was going to be there at the end and who was not earlier on. And in this kind of story, that is a big thing that you are reading to the end for, to see who makes it and see who doesn't. So, still, really good book. Definitely worth the price. I know you can pick it up on Amazon now. I know there's a number of add-ons that are not going to be in there. I believe the prose story is one. I don't remember what they all are, but the story itself is still very solid, and I think it's worth checking out if you enjoy Westerns, if you enjoy this kind of justice for the condemned kind of a story. It's definitely going to scratch your itch. Let me know what you thought of this book down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit. I'll talk to you later.